Hey everyone, and welcome to my Support Offrole guide. I want to start this video off by talking about why you should choose Support as your Offrole. Support has a wide variety of classes. You can be an Engager and set your team up. You can be an Enchanter and peel your team. You can be a Playmaker and express your skill and roam around. You can be a Mage and deal damage. So there's something for everyone. And it's just generally enjoyable. You have a huge amount of agency and freedom comparatively to other roles. It's also no secret that Support has the lowest barrier of entry. It has a low skill floor. So to perform serviceably on Support is easier than performing serviceably on other roles. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a high skill ceiling, but it is forgiving as an off-role. If you're a top main, you can share a long lane and play champs more similar to your champions than ADC. Let's say you play tanks in the top lane, it'll be much easier to go from that to Alistair and Braum and Taric than to ADCs, and you can still share that long lane. Junglers, you don't have to worry about CS, and that's one of the biggest transitions going from jungle to a lane. Supports become secondary junglers very quickly. Mid laners don't have to worry as much about the longer lane as you're less tied to minions. It can be quite a shock going from the short lane of mid to a longer lane and having to deal with higher threats of ganks and freezes. ADCs, they already have the advantage of sharing a lane with supports and having an intuition for the role inbuilt already. If you find yourself thinking, I wish my support would do this, now this is your chance to do exactly that for your ADC. Now, you get Support Offrole a lot comparatively to other Offroles, so you owe it to yourself and your climb and your journey to work on your Offrole support. If you just got it 1 in 20, 1 in 30 games, whatever, just lock in Yuumi and hope for the best or dodge. But most of the time, it's going to be a significant factor in your climb. So whichever role you're coming from as your main role, and whichever class that you choose to play as a support, it's going to go a long way to play simple and easy to execute champions. My number one recommendation for this are Enchanters. They're forgiving, they're reactive, they scale well, and they're relatively easy to execute. And they're also relevant at all levels of play. For other champions worth a shout out, Maokai as an engager, simple and easy to execute and scales very well. And I'm also going to include Nautilus because he is simple and he is easy to execute. Unfortunately, there is more pressure on Nautilus to snowball the early game and he doesn't scale as well. And so you normally don't want to put too much pressure on yourself to accelerate and snowball on your off-roll. I would also include Braum, but he is hard to blind pick and he struggles in a lot of different comps. My Ziggs off-roll is a perfect example of playing simple and easy to execute champions. I get off-role ADC very infrequently. When I do get it, I ask for support, and the vast majority of the time I get given it. Other times I can just dodge. But when I do play ADC, I have that easy to execute, simple identity, unpunishing gameplay. I'm not going to lock in Draven or Samira or Vayne and hope for the best. So at the end of the day, it's going to come down to how often you get off-role. If it's very infrequently, one trick a super basic champion. If you get off-role quite often, I would say 25% or more of your games, then you can put a little bit more thought and effort into your pool. So with that said, to have a smooth transition, if and only if you get off-role regularly, you can play a support class that reflects your mains class. If you're coming from the top lane and you typically play bruisers or tanks, I suggest picking up Maokai or Nautilus, and then Alistair or Rel. 1 to 2 champions from here. If you're coming from jungle, I recommend looking for an engager or a playmaker. 1 or 2 of Maokai or Nautilus or Alistair or Rel. And you can also have a look at Bard and Rakan. The reason that Bard and Rakan are at the end of the tier here is because they are quite forgiving. It's very hard to die on either of these champions. Their skill ceiling is much higher and their identity much more finicky and harder to execute. I strongly suggest staying away from Pyke and Thresh. If you're coming from mid and you play mages, I would encourage picking enchanters. I think you would have the best time picking Soraka or Karma, but honestly any enchanter here is going to serve a similar purpose. Soraka and Karma have the most mage-like elements, I would say, in poking out and punishing in lane. If you play assassins in mid, playmakers would make the most sense, and for that it's just going to be Bard and Rakan, ideally staying away from the Pyke and the Thresh. If you ever have a playmaker in your off-role pool, it needs to be your one-trick off-role. If you're an ADC and you're playing off-role support, you have a bit more flexibility here. The smoothest transition, what makes the most sense, is playing an enchanter because they are ranged and you can space and kite appropriately. But you also may have a feel for playing with engaged supports when they should look to engage, maybe you can do that yourself. So I want to make an Offrole support to-do list for you guys. First of all, you want to choose your champion or champions, max 2 champions Offrole, again, depending on how often you get the role. Have a think of what would make the most sense for your personality, your playstyle, your main role that you're coming from. If in doubt, we can always go to Maokai or Enchanters from anywhere. And then we're going to start by learning and embracing your champion's identity. We can't just learn the general role of support. You need to understand what your champion does. An analogy I like to use is that if you're on a scenic bike ride, you can't explore and enjoy the scenery if you don't even know how to ride the bike. And for you to be able to lift your eyes off of the brakes and the handlebars, you're going to need that muscle memory. You're going to need to understand how your bike works first and foremost. And the bike is your champion, and the scenery is League of Legends for this analogy. Learn how to ride the bike first. Now, ideally, learning your champion's identity is relatively simple due to choosing a simple champ. If not, I do have coaching guides for a lot of the more complex champions, if not all of them. I will link the playlist for my champion guides down below. You can sign up through my Patreon to get coaching and educational content for everything you might need. But just understand that if you do choose a more complex champion, your off-role will be harder. I do want to quickly mention that enjoyment is always an important factor in our climb. So if you don't have fun on these simple champions, and you are drawn to the more complex champions, that is going to help out to some extent for enjoyment. On that note though, the way that I see off-role is that it's your job to be as serviceable as possible and do your job, even if that means playing boring champions. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but it is going to depend on how often you get off-role. The less often you get it, the more you want to pick simple champions and just do your job. In order to learn and embrace your champion's identity, you're also going to need to get the reps in. It's worth considering spamming the champion that you choose in norms or in flex queue or on your smurf to get a feel of them. Play aggressively, explore your champion's limits, figure out what you can and can't get away with, and then when you play on your main in solo queue, you can play to the level that you're comfortable with. I want to include some important points to keep in mind as a support off-roller. Supports have low gold and low EXP in comparison to every other role, so they are going to be squishy, even engagers and melee supports. That's why I don't call them tanks. They're never really tanky. Actively think about what wave state you want in the laning phase and bot. Although you may still be relevant by practically AFKing and pressing buttons on your ADC as an enchanter for the entire game, you can dominate lane too. You can shove and you can poke and you can pressure as enchanters. You can actively freeze as engagers. I recommend checking out my support fundamentals wave states video for this. You are also going to struggle to do anything by yourself. You can't go on solo missions. This is going to be especially relevant in the mid to late game. You're going to need to be comfortable doing nothing in windows of downtime. Just sit and fog, just wait for your team to be actively pressuring the map. If you have itchy feet and you feel like you need to do something constantly, you're probably just going to end up dying a lot. Being a psycho in the early game can be rewarding, but I really want you guys to focus on doing the right things and pressuring with your team in the mid to late game. Mid first, mid first, mid first. Can't stress this concept enough. Contest for mid prio with your team. Get a mid ward in the middle of the lane as deep as safely possible. Actively communicate to your teammates in advance to get everyone on the same page and understand why it's important so that you can have control of the middle of the map. You can move anywhere. You can control anywhere. When in doubt, play for mid first. In terms of warding, I don't want to go into this too much because it is your off role, but the main points for this is just avoid solo missions. You're going to need help from your team. Wait for your team and especially your jungler to link up with them and ward mid as deep as safely possible. That's going to be good enough for your off-roll. I got some reflections from a couple of very smart individuals who have experience from playing support off-roll. The first is from Coach Curtis, who is a mid lane main and has played plenty of support off-roll. He found that roaming was effectively very tricky to implement as a playstyle. He ended up tunneling on lane, and this hurt champions that need to roam a little bit more as their identity. So this just strengthens the argument for champions that function the best in lane and who scale well. That is enchanters. And we can see that reflected in the win rate over here. He had the most success by far on Sona. Maybe it's boring, maybe it's simple, but it gets the job done. He also noted that it flowed very nicely from mid, as he felt the role of support as an extension of game sense which you can express through mid. He didn't feel the need to carry with mechanics, which might be the case for, say, ADC. He also struggled a little bit with different classes in his off-role pool. Even though he got it relatively often, having an engager like a Nautilus and an enchanter like Sona have very different playstyles, and it would be better to probably choose 1 or 2 champions within the same class. Moving on to the next off-role support case study, we have Nathan Mott here, jungle main, fantastic player and coach, just like Coach Curtis is. And here you can get a sense of how often he has gotten his support off-role. It is his second most played champion, and we can see he is floundering with an unfortunate 39% win rate on his Nautilus. And so while Nautilus is simple and is relatively easy to execute in the sense that his hooks are forgiving and his ult is point and click, the pace of game that he demands, needing to snowball and create win cons, can be jarring as an off-role. And so what I think Nathan should do is try to swap out Nautilus with a different champion. Maybe Enchanter and ranged champions isn't his style. He can add the Maokai, as we can see here. He already has played a lot of that champion, and he can absolutely be a solid support option. Potentially Rel, as Rel shares a jungle and support role as well. Or just bite the bullet and dive into the deep end and try to learn a completely different class like Enchanters. But just to get an indication of what we're looking at here, he has won 27 out of his 70 games played on Nautilus. If he found an approach to his support off-role that allowed him to go 50% win rate, that would be about 160 plus more LP that he could be sitting on, which is no joke, so absolutely important to take your off-role seriously. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed. Big thank you to all of my Patreons over here. I really couldn't do this without you. The links for coaching, for Patreon, for my School of Support Discord server, for socials, they're all going to be linked in the description below. Any and all support is greatly appreciated.